Welcome, everyone. I think it's time to get started. We're very excited this evening to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm sure all of y'all noticed this summer that the Inflation Reduction Act passed. That it was the biggest investment in climate in United States history, and it has the potential to make huge differences in our emissions and in our climate future. Unfortunately, like most things, it doesn't necessarily run itself, that we need to do things to make sure that we get the results that we need from that. And as part of that, we've invited Matt Salton, the federal campaigns manager from the League of Conservation Voters, to help us understand what's in this act and what we need to do to get the full benefit from it. As a federal campaigns manager for LCV, Matt is responsible for coordinating federal campaign efforts between the New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland League of Conservation Voters organizations. He grew up caring about the environment and became an Eagle Scout. He's a graduate of Gettysburg College with a BA in Environmental Studies and Political Science. Before coming to LCV, he was the Environmental Action Associate at Hudson River Sloop Clearwater and a political organizer working on several electoral campaigns in New York and Pennsylvania to get environmental champions elected to office. So he's in an ideal position to help us understand what we need to do to get the full benefit from this very important bill.
Oh, Francis, yeah.
So Matt, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me here to speak with you all. It's a very exciting time to be doing this kind of work. I sort of came into it right at the cusp of its passage. So initially, when I was looking at the job, it was about how do we get this thing passed? And by the time I came on, it was how are we going to implement it? So first, because the news is so relevant, I just wanted to point out that there was something hanging over the head of this victory of the Inflation Reduction Act passing when it did, and that was the fact that there was going to be a side deal with Senator Joe Manchin about permitting reform for natural gas and oil projects, specifically about the Mountain Valley Pipeline that Senator Manchin really wanted to get. That was assumed that it was going to happen, but through dedicated advocates like yourselves, that was actually able to be stopped this evening. They decided to pull it from the continuing resolution, which is needed to keep the government funded. Joe Manchin pulled it out because he simply did not have the votes. So in essence, the Inflation Reduction Act has passed. That money will be going where it needs to go. That legislation will take action, but the side deal for now is at least stalled. So now getting into the Inflation Reduction Act, let me please share my screen and get started on that. So whenever I speak about the Inflation Reduction Act, I always want to do a broad overview about what it is, because it is historic. Yes, it is a lot of money. It's $360 billion for climate and environment, but it's important to break it down into more manageable bites. What is the IRA? It's clean energy. It's the development of clean energy. It's the funding of clean energy through tax incentives and through grants and through opportunities. It's buildings and how do we decarbonize buildings. It's transportation and how do we decarbonize the transportation sector and make it more efficient. It's healthy communities. How do we roll back some of the environmental injustices that we have seen as a result of racist policies in the past? Through energy. It's agriculture. How do we factor agriculture into fighting the climate crisis? It's clean manufacturing, about boosting American jobs and making things here cleaner and to reduce the amount of supply chain disruption. And it's about public lands and waters, how we foster those most sacred resources that we as a country hold. All of these things together are a ton of policy, and they are a ton of things to look into, but they are also a singular bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is what I'm going to be speaking about right now. Quick summary of the benefits. So basically, the Inflation Reduction Act is a holistic effort on part of the United States government to reduce our carbon emissions and to curb the worst effects of the climate crisis. Now, because of this bill, we are going to cut about 40% of climate emissions by 2030 and remove about a gigaton of emissions by 2030. And this has just never been done before. There has never been large-scale climate action on this scale by the federal government, or frankly, anywhere in the world before. Now, that is what this bill does. And then there are other things that we can do to get us to that 50% reduction by 2030 that the Biden administration has put forward in the Paris Accord. And that has to do with action on the state and local level, that has to do with federal rules changes, all of which that LCV and other partners such as yourselves will be working on in the coming years. But primarily what this does, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, is that it will raise revenues through a 15% corporate minimum tax. There are a whole host of healthcare benefits to help negotiate prescription drug prices and Medicare, allowing them to negotiate. But when it comes to the energy and environment section, it is about saving household money on energy costs, up to about $1,800 annually for income for families to take advantage of the electrification incentives. It's about rolling back those environmental injustices. At least 40% of the benefits will go to disadvantaged, low wealth, or mostly fossil fuel harm communities. It will create jobs. It will make our communities healthier, averting 3,900 premature deaths and 100,000 asthma attacks yearly by 2030. And this will all be done through a more fair tax code that helps working people and makes the wealthy pay more of a fair share so that we can reduce the deficit, reduce inflation, and help working people thrive in a cleaner and more equitable economy. So particularly for this group, just because you're so focused on the actual climate ramifications of this, oftentimes when I talk about it, it's much more about what it can actually do for individuals, and they're not as concerned with the overall climate implications of this. But this is a really great graphic to show just how much this policy will help. The current policy we have, we were expecting about a 24 to 35% reduction in carbon emissions just based on market trends alone, essentially. Not a lot of some state action, and then just market trends. Because of this federal action, we can now expect 31 to 44% reduction of emissions by 2030. And again, there's still more to go to get us to that Paris Agreement target, which will be done on the state and local level and about federal rules. But I think this graphic is just a great one to see how much of a game changer this legislation is. So now let's start breaking it down. Clean energy. What will this do? I'm not going to read all of these things, but I just thought they were important to include here so people can read them. I'm just going to talk about some of the big things. Again, most of this bill is about decarbonizing the American economy. And we're going to be doing that through both producing more clean energy and making things more efficient so we use less energy. But to do that, we need to produce more clean energy. And that's why it's 10-year extensions of full value, 30% tax incentives for clean energy development. This means we'll have big projects go online, all of which have to have strong labor and domestic content requirements so that workers and people don't get left behind in this clean energy transformation. That is tax incentives, but not every institution has the tax space where they could get a credit because they don't have enough liability. In those circumstances, there is direct pay of incentives to nonprofits, to co-ops, to government entities to help them deploy as much clean energy as possible onto our grid. We need to decarbonize the grid, because if we don't decarbonize the grid, then our electricity isn't entirely clean. And the goal is to get everything that is on fossil fuels to move to electricity and to move our electricity to an entirely carbon-free grid. I want to mention the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, $27 billion. Some states have a version of this. You might have heard them called green banks or technology accelerators for clean energy. New York has one, Connecticut has one. They are private investment funding mechanisms for projects, for clean energy projects in low-income communities, low-wealth communities, and communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the fossil fuel industry, such as if you know your communities and you know that there is a power plant nearby, we need to sort of reevaluate why that power plant was put there, what were the intentions, and most likely it was because the communities there did not have the political capital to oppose it in the first place. This fund will help transition that fossil fuel infrastructure that makes the air dirtier into a cleaner version, so people have cleaner air to breathe, cleaner water to drink, and safer food to eat. A lot of this bill has been talked about in terms of numbers, really big numbers like 27 billion. It's been talked about in terms of paying for things, and not a lot about the standards that also come along with it. So the methane emissions reduction program is put in place to incentivize swift action in the oil and gas industry to charge for further leaks and waste. Methane is very potent as a greenhouse gas, especially when it leaks from a pipeline or from a project. And right now, there is not enough oversight over those projects where they are incentivized to actually cap and further prevent those leaks and wastes of methane that escape into the atmosphere. This is going to change that. And there's also a grant for rural co-ops for loans from the DOE to reduce power plant emissions. Again, we want to transition power plants, transition the economy off of carbon and into a clean, renewable energy economy. Now, there are some things in the bill that aren't good, frankly. Support for carbon capture and sequestration at power plants is not the first course of action. The first course of action is to ramp up clean energy developments, but this was also put in the bill that could keep the fossil fuel industry alive a little bit longer. The goal here is to reduce as much carbon as possible. Transportation. So transportation actually accounts for the biggest amount of carbon in our economy. It used to be power plant production, but because coal plants have been dwindling and clean energy is rising, transportation is actually now our biggest emitting sector. The number one thing that we talk about when it comes to transportation, because people ask about it all the time, are the electric vehicle tax credits. Right now, or before the bill passed rather, if you wanted to buy an electric car, there was a good chance that you could have gotten a $7,500 tax credit. Now, that sounded familiar for the past decade or so. A lot of car manufacturers actually didn't offer that anymore because there was a stipulation in that credit that said that if a manufacturer manufactured 200,000 units of electric vehicles, then the credit no longer applied. So Toyota, Ford, GM, these manufacturers already passed that milestone a little bit ago. Really, any mass-produced car did, except for the luxury vehicles. That requirement of 200,000 is now scrubbed. It's good for any electric vehicle new. And for the first time, $4,000 credit for used vehicles. These all have stipulations about MSRP value and income levels, but the important thing here is that it is now cheaper to buy an electric car, but it's also cheaper to produce an electric car, to make them here. These incentives are for producing the electric cars here, making sure they're built here, and because they are going to be built domestically, we have less worry to worry about supply chain issues, which contribute to cost and the added environmental degradation that comes along with shipping things across the world when we could make them here in America. There is also money for aviation fuels and for investment in state work to reduce climate pollution from transportation systems. There's money for school buses for schools to get onto clean buses. There is money for UPS trucks and for heavy duty trucks to take the transportation sector from being our largest emitter of carbon to dwindling it to carbon free. Healthy communities. Like I mentioned, this is about rolling back injustices. That's why there's money for air quality monitoring. There's money for block grant programs where $3 billion is a lot of money to help reduce pollution in these communities that have traditionally been harmed because they did not have the political capital to oppose these projects in the first place. There is Superfund money to actually clean up a lot of these Superfund sites that will be put in on a tax on the very oil companies that caused a lot of cases these Superfunds to become degraded. There's money to revitalize communities that have been damaged by federal highway projects and transportation access, improving there to reduce pollution everywhere across the board. Clean manufacturing. Again, this is a jobs program. President Biden oftentimes said when he thought of climate, he thought of jobs. This is about incentivizing clean energy manufacturing here in the United States. When we put this together with the investment, the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and also the CHIPS Act, this is all about making more things in America and making them cleaner and producing more clean energy jobs that are tied to union labor that must have apprenticeships in order to get a lot of this funding. So it's transitioning us to a clean energy economy without forgetting the workers who will help get us there. Buildings. So I live in New York City. Our greatest carbon emitter is buildings. A lot of cities that is because transportation isn't as carbon intensive in major urban areas. So when it comes to buildings, it's about taking them off of carbon, modernizing them, retrofitting them, building new buildings that are energy efficient. And when it comes to individual bases, if you have an apartment building, let's say, and right now it has a fossil fuel, natural gas, water heater, you can transition that to getting a heat pump. There are incentives to do that. That'll cover a good chunk of that bill. And then everyone in the building has an AC unit. There are incentives to get heat pumps into people's homes, which can produce cold weather inside when it's hot outside and warm temperature inside when it's cold outside. Suddenly, if you do that apartment by apartment, if you do that by house, you're suddenly decarbonizing buildings in your community. So there are a lot of benefits that individuals can take on this front. There are energy retrofits and incentives for that, where your home might not be the most resistant to, or insulated rather. There's money to do that, to get rewiring done, to make your home a lot more energy efficient. And again, there are a lot of job training opportunities here as well. I think the job training opportunities here and the manufacturing is an important part of this, politically speaking, because people aren't going to want to strip this away. When things are being built in their districts, Congress people, even who voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, they're not going to want to roll any of this back because it's money spent in their district. It's for jobs in their district. People's livelihoods will be tied to this, and they'll be better off for it. And the air will be cleaner, and the grid will be cleaner as well. Agriculture, there's $21+ billion in investment in conservation programs. I'm sure a lot of your communities are climate smart agricultural committees and practices that will help with our crops and farmland. I know next month, the call will be about the Farm Bill. So I'm sure you'll be talking about that a little bit more then, but also investments in sustainable infrastructure. And a lot of these provisions are for either low income or rural communities. That's the language in the bill, because we don't want to forget about rural communities in this transition. So it's important that we have this money for rural electric cooperatives that we have the money to develop clean energy in rural parts of the country as well. And there's money to protect and restore forests, because when we talk about carbon sequestration, the first thing we should think about are natural carbon sinks, which are our forests and wetlands. Now, public lands and waters, I know some people on this call are from out west, and this is a lot more of a daily interaction than for me, but there's a lot here about public lands and waters. It's about boosting fees and royalties that will require oil and gas companies to pay their fair share to extract resources on public lands and waters, which in turn will be used to fund conservation projects. There will be a rollback of Trump's ban on offshore wind power in the south, on the southeast coast, which will create jobs and help get us off of fossil fuels. There's money for coastal restoration projects, what we've seen with Hurricane Ida and Irene and Sandy, and now with our newest hurricane. We need to restore our coasts naturally, and this money will help us do that. There's money for the NPS. There's money to prevent wildfires, which is such an important issue right now on the West Coast and in the more arid climates that we face. I mean, a lot of you were just telling me before the call about just the extreme heat waves and forest fires that you've been dealing with. Again, this bill is not perfect. There are issues that we'll continue to fight back on, and that includes a requirement that future onshore and offshore oil and gas lease sales are a prerequisite for holding renewable energy lease sales on public lands and waters. And we're going to fight this as LCV. We're going to fight it as an environmental community. It also revives 4 canceled or disputed offshore drilling lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of Alaska, which could threaten coastal economies. So there's a lot to this bill. It's massive. And frankly, it's hard to keep track of. Every time I speak about this bill, I never get through all of it. I can't get through all of it. It would be a multi-hour presentation, which none of you want to sit through and I don't want to give. So the key thing here is that the White House is beginning to ramp up its communications about these programs and incentives and everything else. So this website, the White House put together, and what that does is that it sort of breaks down on a very basic level what is available right now in terms of incentives, what's available starting in the new year, and it'll grow because certain incentives are not available in full until a few years from now. Some, such as electric cars, certain requirements are put in over a few years. So there's a newsletter that you can subscribe to on the White House site that I'm providing, and we can send around after the webinar that you can get updates about this, and you can talk to your accountant and you can find out more about these opportunities when it comes time to file your taxes, to see if you can get any incentives, to see when would be a good time to buy a heat pump or a new stove or appliances or a new car, things like that. So I just kind of want to end before we take questions with just pointing out what a massive, massive new and exciting opportunity this is for people to really get involved in decarbonizing their own lives and their communities. It's about getting solar on your own rooftop or getting community solar. It's about helping schools decarbonize and decarbonize school buses. This is a holistic approach to combating the climate crisis. And we can take action on an individual basis by swapping out an appliance that we don't need anymore or that we want to get a more efficient one. It's about taking these little actions that will become cumulative and will have a big impact on the wider scale. Really what this is about is making the United States a beacon for all those who seek a cleaner world. It's about ramping up clean energy production at home, and it's about reducing our emissions on a broad scale but we do that on the individual and community basis. So I'm thrilled to have been able to speak here today. I'm looking forward to your questions, and this is going to be a big deal for a long time, and we're going to keep talking about it, and we're going to ensure that it's implemented at the state level, so that way these emission reductions actually come to fruition.
Thanks, Matt. That was a great tour of a very large and complex subject, and we've got a number of questions about that. Some questions about the electric grid. What is in the bill to help expand the grid to help meet all these new demands? And does the bill address any of the permitting issues?
Yep. So the bill does not address the permitting issues that was going to be dealt with in this permitting side deal. Now, the hope is that the good parts of the permitting bill, because it did allow for permitting reform when it came to transmission lines, which we're going to have to do in order to get energy from where it's produced to energy where it's consumed. So that's going to be follow-up legislation that I'm going to imagine will come about in pretty soon, because the Manchin bill just was defeated. But in terms of the grid, it's a lot about production and ramping up our clean energy development, so that way the grid has that capacity for when we're going to all have to plug in our cars and plug in our stoves and everything else.
Okay, so someone else asked, is there anything in the bill about biogas from livestock and dairy operations, and does LCV have a position on that?
That I'm not sure. I'd have to get back to you on that.
Okay, that's good. If you could get back to us, we can hopefully get that information back to folks. Someone's worried about the chances that a Republican House could reverse or nullify some or most of the important parts of the bill with or without changes in the representation in the Senate.
Yeah, so I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but this is not going, hopefully, this is not going to be a kind of political shiny object for too long, because of the amount of investments made to American manufacturing and to jobs and for everything else, that it's going to be proved to be a very popular measure, that people are going to be applying for funds, especially Republicans on the municipal level and state level. They want these funds too. But unfortunately, it was wrapped up in a lot of politics at the national level that I think now we can move back from a little bit as we move forward and we start to see the benefits. Because frankly, if people are getting money to get newer appliances, to getting a new electric car, things like that, they're not going to be happy if you want to roll them back, even if you're a Republican.
Mm-hmm. Great. So there is a lot in the bill that's going to affect people's personal choices in terms of their cars, their appliances, how they heat their homes, all those sorts of things. Is there any provision in the bill for communicating with the public about those things and about the need to create resilient communities?
I don't think there's money directly for that, but the White House is certainly trying to communicate. And then there are a lot of nonprofits, such as your group, such as LCV, that are trying to do that. But yeah, they're going to, I think that's going to be one of the main things, is that if people know that they can apply for these incentives and get these tax incentives, if they do switch out their furnace for a heat pump, then that's what's going to make all the difference.
Mm-hmm. There's also a question about there are all these coal-fired power plants on Native American lands and in other communities. And is there anything in the bill about longer-term help for these communities after these plants are dismantled?
Yeah, there are. Let me just go back here. Yeah, there's certainly money for Native American communities in the bill that help address some of those disparities, but I'm not seeing it right now.
Yeah,
But
as I recall, they refer to them as energy communities and have
yep.
some special programmatic things for them. Being originally from West Virginia, I noticed that part.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that right now, but it's certainly there. And I'd have to, again, get back to you just because there's so much in this bill.
It's absolutely huge. So another question is, will there be an organized effort to connect provisions of the IRA with the plans for implementation of the CLCPA in New York State?
Absolutely, there will be, yes. Right now, the state government, especially NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Agency, will certainly be taking into account the new funds available to them to ramp up New York's goals set about from the CLCPA. For folks who don't know, the CLCPA, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, was New York's bill to reduce carbon emissions set about in 2019. So it was basically New York State's version of IRA.
Oh, great. So another question was, how long until the EV charging stations start to be built and people can know they can drive across the country in an electric vehicle?
Yep. So a lot of states are already taking those actions to get them built on their own throughway systems. New York, for example, has done that. But there are going to be more opportunities now because of this federal funding. And they're going to take advantage of them right now to get those built. Because again, that is an issue. When you talk to people about whether or not they want to buy an electric car, range anxiety comes up, and whether or not, frankly, the electricity that's going to go and power their car, whether or not that's going to be clean. Because right now, if you plug in, there's no guarantee that it's going to be clean energy. So it's about ramping up production of clean energy so that the electricity is clean. And then it's going to be about having reliable service and having that built infrastructure. A lot of those funds will also come from the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So someone asked, is there a mechanism to require utilities to move away from fossil fuels? For example, can the federal law influence the DPU of Massachusetts?
I don't believe that in this bill there was anything about forcing or telling state utilities what to do, but there are certain incentives that you can only get if you do basically play nice with the federal government and take their prescriptions. There are specifically building codes, which is a big one, where the Department of Energy will have a number of incentives on the table that will help states to revamp and update their building codes to make them more efficient and lower carbon intensive. And states can only get that if the state signs on and works with the DOE to craft those provisions.
Oh, great. So this probably relates to what you were just talking about, but a little more detail. Are there financial incentives in the bill for landlords to upgrade appliances and other aspects of their property in their rental properties?
Yep, all the same things that affect individuals. Those incentives are also available to landlords and to housing developers. Again, they're going to get the incentives to do that, so they're going to be incentivized to go and do that. But you can certainly also talk to your landlord because, again, as someone mentioned, communication is going to be a hurdle here. So your landlord might not necessarily know about all the benefits that are available here.
So I pointed out that one of the things Elders Climate Action has been doing is working with other groups to try to get the AARP to pay more attention to climate change and do more consumer education, because they have 38 million Americans who get a magazine from them each month. And there was a question about, does LCV have a relationship with AARP? And if not, Would you all like to have one?
That I can speak to, frankly. I'm mostly on the state level with the 4 states that you mentioned before, but I can check.
Okay, great. Certainly for years, industry's been talking about carbon capture and sequestration. And it's been very expensive, hasn't been very effective. There's some provisions in the bill about this. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so primarily carbon capture and sequestration has been used as a way for the industry to extend itself. For example, I'll give a very specific example that I worked on prior to coming to LCV, similar to some hydrogen projects, where a fossil fuel peaker plant would be required under the New York State CLCPA to not produce any electricity from natural gas by a certain date. And they had a plan to transition the plant into a fully functional plant rather than a peaker plant. This facility would then only have a couple years of operating before they'd have to then shut down, which makes no financial sense. So they said, well, why don't we just put it into hydrogen, make it a hydrogen project as a way to just sort of say, yes, we can continue doing this. And then by the time it happens, they say, oh, well, we already built the infrastructure, we might as well stick around. So a lot of carbon sequestration talk has been sort of like that. It's about extending fossil fuel use into the future. There's certainly a place for it, but it should never be a, first sense of action, where the main source of action should be about producing clean energy.
Great. And people have been putting some useful links in the climate one about codes for climate building, some about what they're doing in Indiana with building decarbonization, an IRA calculator for how much money this bill can save families. So there are lots of things going on with that. And also, some people have been asking, are we going to get a link to the video? Definitely we'll do that, because Matt's been giving us a lot of great information, and it's more than probably most of us can absorb in one exposure, because there's a lot here. Another thing people are concerned about is, will people have a problem with an increased energy cost, but electric versus natural gas?
Yeah, well, that's frankly what the bill tries to tackle. The bill's aim is to lower the cost of clean energy. Through these incentives, people will save money on their electric bills that they currently are paying. And that's through getting rooftop solar or buying into community solar. It's through efficiency by getting new appliances. It's all of these things working in tandem with each other to bring down energy costs. And by the way, because of basic supply and demand, if we suddenly have a lot more access to clean energy, the price will just come down, because that's how supply and demand work. But they will also be working with utilities to ensure that they don't hike rates beyond what's reasonable. The purpose of the bill is to bring down energy costs and to make that energy clean.
Great. So I was asking about, the U.S. military is a huge consumer of fossil fuels, and there certainly are opportunities there to decrease, but it looks like military spending is more likely to increase. So it seems like we've overlooked the biggest opportunity to reduce carbon emissions. And I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah. I don't believe that this bill directly talks about military funding, or the fact that military and the DoD do use a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure and work. But I would say that the main point is to bring the domestic front energy concerns down, and in tandem, then they can probably work with the DoD, but I don't have any, proprietary knowledge on that front.
Each of the military services actually has climate action plans. And if that's something that people are interested in, maybe that's a good topic for another national call, because there certainly is a huge amount of opportunity there. Let's see what I may have missed. If I missed your question, please put it in the Q&A, because we've had it's a very wide-ranging topic with lots of possibilities, and I may have skipped over someone without realizing it. Oh, is there any relationship between the Inflation Reduction Act and the nuclear power industry?
Relationship is the word I'm wondering about. There are funds to keep some nuclear plants online that are currently online, and there is some money for small modular reactors and some more research into it. In terms of the crafting of the legislation, I'm not aware.
Yeah, those things sometimes go under the radar.
Yeah, and I wasn't part of those conversations.
And probably very few people were. Okay, so we've gone through a lot of questions, got some great answers. What else would you all like to know about this? People might feel a little overwhelmed because it's a very large topic.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it's not going away because a lot of these incentives are for about 10 years, and different things happen each year in regard to the standards and practices of each of the incentives. So this is going to be an ongoing thing for quite some time.
And one thing that we do with most of our national calls is give people one specific action to take, which is great, except with this, it's so large. And the big thing with this is that we've passed this bill that covers so many areas of the American economy and the energy system. But passing it is wonderful, and we should all be happy we did that. But implementation is a whole new thing. So implementation is going to be maybe in your kitchen. It's maybe going to be in your city council, in your state house. There are lots of places this is going to happen. So maybe good for people to take a little bit of time to think about what kind of action do they want to take, and do they have questions about how to do that? Oh, but we do have a more specific action. If you take a look at the chat, you can sign up for updates on funding from the bill, because this is going to be something that's going to be rolling out over quite a bit of time. And it's good to be able to find out where things are at any particular point. Okay, someone wants to buy an on-demand water heater, but they've been told they don't work well.
Well, there are heat pump water heaters that are available, and that are also have tax incentives under IRA. So that seems like a good alternative.
Yeah, those are probably not for the most part going to be on demand, but they are very efficient. I think people really don't realize how many different kinds of heat pumps we interact with. Like the heat pump most people have but never realize was a heat pump is their refrigerator.
Or their air conditioner, yeah.
And someone referred, in reference to this bill, referred to heat pumps as being bisexual, that the modern heat pumps can do both heating and cooling.
Yeah.
But I had never run into an on-demand, or rather not on-demand, a heat pump water heater until I started seeing things related to the IRA. So there are new things coming out all the time.
Yeah.
There's a few more questions in the Q&A box, Francis.
Ah, okay. There's so many questions. I'm not keeping up with them. Yep. It's about incentives for heat pumps.
Yep, there are indeed incentives for heat pumps. I think that they'll cover right now. I think it's about $300, but then I think starting next year it'll be 30% of the total cost.
And that can be huge because heat pumps will save you money once you have them, but getting them in there is not necessarily cheap.
Yeah, again, that's the case for a lot of these appliances and technologies, but the more we produce, the more people have them, the cheaper they'll get. And then it's just that upfront cost, which these incentives hope to bring down. And then for the long term, again, they save you money.
Okay, so now that we have the Inflation Reduction Act, what would LCV like to see passed next?
I think certainly about permitting reform, but in an intentional and intelligent way that deals with transmission lines and helps ramp up clean energy projects. Whereas this version of the bill, primarily the point of it was to get the Mountain Valley Pipeline passed for Joe Manchin.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and fortunately that seems to have not gone the way he was hoping. Someone else is asking, the 40% reduction in CO2 by 2030, is it based on 100% buy-in by states, local governments, industry, and everyone?
It's based upon just federal action, and I believe that everything after is just ISO.
Okay. And someone else was asking, do we have an idea when the incentives for owners of rental properties will be available?
Sorry, the what?
The incentives for owners of rental properties to make upgrades.
Okay. I believe they're going to be, if not already available in the new year. Most things start in the new year in full. But if you want to, get new appliances for your rental property, I believe those incentives should be available right now. And if they're not, just for the next year.
Okay. People are asking, what should we focus on in terms of state legislation and how it fits with the federal bill?
Yeah, so that's going to depend on each state, unfortunately. So this is a good opportunity to sort of get to know your state legislatures better, to really see how they will be dealing with the implementation, because a lot of these questions will be done on the state level, and whether or not they really want to take advantage of all that the federal government is going to be giving here. Fortunately, a lot of this bill is through just the federal tax code, so it sort of circumnavigates a lot of state legislatures. But there are a lot of things that state legislatures can do to not only match what this funding will do, but perhaps even succeed it, helping even more than the bill does right now with direct payment or with programs or things like that. So I'd say keep an eye out on your own state legislature, and then take a look over to what other states are doing. In this particular coalition, you have a lot of states. Talk to folks about what each person's state has done and what your state could be doing. That's frankly the basis of state legislation. They just look to other states to see what they've been doing so that they can copy it and hopefully improve upon it.
I know certainly in my state and in my county that this funding should make a lot of things financially feasible that people have wanted to do, but there's been concern about that. Someone's asking about incentives for decreasing electrical use, like turning lights off in large office buildings.
That I don't believe is in the bill, but I think what will happen with the bill a little bit more, because of these financial incentives and because of talking about it, I think it will increase the knowledge of the public about why these things matter, and it will create, I think, a culture of conserving energy and being very intentional with energy use, because we're talking about it so much and it has this newfound importance.
Mm-hmm. And someone else is asking, are there things we should be doing to track the funding through the states to make sure it's used properly?
Yep.
Okay. And someone else was asking about the impact of all the incentives in the IRA on advocacy that people have done in the past or continuing to do on having a carbon fee.
There's nothing in this bill about a carbon fee. I've heard this bill be described as really mostly carrot and very little stick. But I think that was done very intentionally, so it could have the long-term benefits that something like a carbon fee would not have, just because, as we've seen recently with inflation, people can scapegoat policies and people when it comes to rising energy costs. But the Inflation Reduction Act really gives people money to make their energy cheaper, which won't have that effect.
So what the ask is, how's the federal government going to ramp up to implement all of this?
That's a great question. And the answer is all of you. It's through individuals buying in and actually trusting the process and being altruistic in some respects, but then just being fiercely individualistic in others. So as long as people do it, then the federal government can do it as well.
Someone else was commenting that one of the problems for consumers is that most contractors don't have an overall view of the opportunities to improve energy efficiency and savings. They're just selling a particular service. And how do we find contractors who know how to do that?
Well, frankly, I think they'll just pop up. People, again, when there's a lot of money available and a lot of tax incentives to be had, people are going to take advantage of them. And in this respect, it works to our benefit because people taking advantage of these incentives and benefits means that we lower our carbon emissions.
Someone's asking, will the poor and the other low-income people get a direct benefit, or will they just basically have to wait? And will it be a spend first and then hope for a rebate, or will there be some upfront help?
I think there's upfront help, if I'm not mistaken, with that, but a lot of these are also going to be done on the community basis through block grants and things like that. And state services that help low-income folks will definitely be there to supplement and help ensure the implementation.
Also, I was asking about money available for building green schools or making our existing schools more green.
Yep. So again, that falls into the same as the incentives to make buildings greener and to rewire them and to make them more efficient and to insulate them, schools or buildings. And it applies to vehicles because buses are vehicles and there's money for EV buses.
Okay. Any last questions? We've covered a wide area, but there's even more that we probably could.
Yeah.
Oh, comes another one. Does the IRA touch on past commitments under the Obama administration to provide funding to developing countries to address climate change?
I'm not sure about the IRA in particular, but the US Senate just passed a climate treaty that will in turn help other countries meet their obligations. But I think, frankly, the main purpose of it is to have the United States lead on these issues. Oftentimes in the debate about addressing the climate crisis, we've heard, why should the United States have to do it if X, Y, and Z countries aren't doing it? And the answer is because we lead on things and because we contribute a lot of carbon emissions proportional to our population. This bill is us leading on this.
Yeah, that's very important, especially to go into the next COP. It's going to be a huge issue.
Yeah.
Especially with a COP in Africa.
Yep.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. This is a huge topic, and you've done a great job in giving us a tour through it and answering a lot of our questions. And we're really looking forward to continuing to work with LCV as this moves on through the next 10 or more years. So thank you so much. And everyone, have a great evening.
Thank you. I'll be here for the next 10 years.
And think about what you want to do in your homes and your communities and your states.